And Yasher Koch to Mark Merrill for arranging the Shiur and publicizing, and a beautiful opportunity to be able to learn together. Additional thank you to the sponsors of the Shiur, Raphy and Simi, Sassieni, Ilan Bagley, Daniel Klein, and an anonymous sponsor. So thank you to one and all. So Shemita is almost upon us, another 2 weeks, and with a new year, Rosh Hashanah, we also have the opportunity for a very special year, which is Shemita, and we should just take note of the opportunity and just be cognizant of what this is. I think sometimes people get sort of caught up in the details. And Shemita has its complexities. So what are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? What do you do with food, etc., etc.? Let's understand that the Torah refers to Shemita as Shna Shabbasoni Yeva'aretz. It's like a year worth of Shabbos. So there's tremendous potential for kedusha in an entire year of Shabbos, and that's something that is certainly worth thinking about as we go into Rosh Hashanah to begin an entire year of elevated Kedusha, and to think about over the course of the year as well. So what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes, short minutes, talking about, just conceptually, what does Shemita mean for us? What are some of the messages of Shemita? And then go through some of the basic halachic topics as well, things to be aware of with regard to Shemita. And certainly, if anyone has any questions, they're more than welcome over the course of this year to participate, to speak up, write in the chat or whatever it is, and we'll do what we can. And there's also the possibility of follow up after this year as well. Happy to be available for any consultations people might be interested in having. So on one level, what are some of the messages of Shemita? We're talking about not losing sight of the experience just because of the details. What is that experience? What are the messages that Shemita is trying to communicate to us? And there may be very many, maybe quite a number of messages. One of them, the Torah says quite explicitly, Torah says that we do not work the land during the Shemitah year. Torah says, Ki li haaretz, because the land is mine. So Shemita essentially is a time out in our making use of our own land to remind us that we are not the ultimate owners of the land, that there's a higher authority, and that the land really belongs to him. So this is an important thing when a person has ownership over something, so then he can do whatever he wants. So why can't I use my land as I see fit? It's a reminder that there's a higher authority, that we are not the ultimate owners, even of our own land. And I think that the Torah envisions land as the most basic, fundamental commodity. Keep in mind, Bnei Yisrael come into Eretz Yisrael, each person gets their nachala, gets their piece of land, and that's something that comes back to you in the Yovel. That's something that you never lose. Your ancestral plot. At least as far as Dinei Torah are concerned and are conceived of. So when the Torah then says, but keep in mind that this land, which is your ancestral nachala, and which even if you sell, will come back to you. But wait a second, really, it's not totally yours. So that's a major statement. And I think that from the Torah's perspective, if the Torah sees that to be the case with regard to land, which is such a fundamental thing, and so clearly, belonging to a person that it can't even be sold forever. So certainly that's the case with other types of property as well. I think the Torah's message in Shemitah, at least part of the Torah's message, is take a step back and let's realize, where does it all come from? Who does it all belong to in the big picture? And that has certain obligations of us, that obligates us to act in certain ways. So that's a possible small takeaway from the basic concept of Shemitah. Another small takeaway from the concept of Shemitah. We know that one of the one of the laws of Shemitah is that the produce that does grow, which we'll discuss exactly what produce, which times of the year, which year even, but the produce that does grow, a person is supposed to make hefker, a person is supposed to declare ownerless, and anyone can come and reap that produce. So that's an important halacha, but certainly on a conceptual level as well. Torah is giving us a year in which essentially the economic, socioeconomic strata sort of gets stripped away. Everyone is the same in most years. So if I'm a successful landowner, then I have my field, I have my crops, and I have to leave a corner for the poor, which is nice of me. I think I'm a big tzaddik for doing that, and the poor come and they come at the end and they take a little corner, or whatever I give them. But in the Shemitah, it's not that I have everything and I have to leave a little corner. Everyone has equal access to everything. So that's not because the Torah doesn't believe in private property. The Torah does believe in the concept of private property, but at the same time, the Torah wants to put into place a certain checks and balances in that system, and to give a year in which, at least on a social level, I'm not sure that this necessarily takes care of anyone's economic problems and eliminates poverty, but at least for 1 year on a social level, everyone's, the playing field is much more level. And that's something also that is, I think, important food for thought with regard to some of the takeaways from Shemitah. And it's also just worth raising, interesting discussion we could have around we could think about for ourselves, we could have around the table on Rosh Hashanah or whatever else it is. What are some other takeaways? What are some messages that the Torah is imparting to us with the mitzvah of Shemitah? Kedai to look in the psukim of the mitzvah of Shemitah, which are primarily in Parshas Behar, and I certainly recommend as a resource Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon's sefer on Yonei Shemitah, and it's a beautiful, beautiful sefer, both in terms of halacha, and he has a section at the beginning as well on some of the concepts, some of the messages that Shemitah is meant to impart as well. Okay, so that's a little bit by way of introduction. Let's proceed to some of the halachos of Shemitah. We're not going to be able to talk about everything today, but at least some basics, and hopefully, some of the practically relevant things. So, firstly, just some of the basic laws of Shemitah. The Torah forbids agricultural labor in Eretz Yisrael during the Shemitah year. There are some malachos which are aser min haTorah. There are various other things which are aser midrabanan. But for as a basic rule, agricultural labor is forbidden during Shemitah. Not only that, but whatever produce does grow. So if it grows in violation of the rules of Shemitah, a person is planting it, a person is protecting it, and not making it hefker, etc., etc. So it's actually forbidden for consumption. But anything that grows on its own without violation of the halachos of Shemitah, for example, most commonly, fruit. Fruit trees don't have to be planted anew each year. Of course, they produce their fruit each year. But not only fruit, anything that grows without the land having to be worked. Let's say vegetables are planted before the Shemitah year, so they keep growing and they can get picked during the Shemitah year. So they have kedusha. They have what's called kedushas shvius, and they have to be treated as such. Interestingly enough, there is a difference between different types of produce as to when they attain the status of Shemitah produce. So it's called peiros shvius. When do they attain that status? When it comes to vegetables and when it comes to grain, so the answer is essentially when it's picked. Vegetables, when they are picked, that's the determining factor. So let's say there's cucumbers growing right now. If they're picked on Erev Rosh Hashanah, they are 60-year produce. If they are picked on the day after Rosh Hashanah, they are Shemitah produce, and they would need to be treated appropriately. As well, the rules governing harvest of Shemitah would apply as well. You cannot harvest in the normal way during Shemitah. And that would all apply from day one to vegetables. On the other hand, when it comes to fruit, so it does not matter when it's picked. In fact, here in Israel, most of the fruit that is currently on the tree will get picked over the course of the coming months in the fall. Those fruit are not kedusha shvius because they began to grow during the 6th year. For fruit, it goes by when it begins to grow. So interestingly enough, the fruit that will be picked after Shemitah is over will be kedusha shvius, because that will start to grow during the Shemitah year. We have here in our garden, we have a couple of trees. We have a pomegranate tree, we have a clementine tree. They have fruit on the tree right now. They all start to grow in the spring. You see the little fruits start to bud, and it starts to grow in the spring. Right now, they're not really ready to be picked yet. They'll be ready to be picked in the coming months. The pomegranates in another month or so, and the clementines in November. So they will not be kedusha shvius. If people come and say, "Hey, we want to come in and pick your clementines," they're hefker. We do not have to let them do so. They're not kedusha shvius. They can be treated like any other. But the ones that'll start to grow next spring, Pesach time, so they will be kedusha shvius. And the following fall, the following September, October, November, December, whenever they're picked, so they will be kedusha shvius. We'll have to hang up a sign, hefker. Anyone who wants to come pick them is more than welcome. And all you guys are welcome to come and pick as many fruit at that time as you like. So therefore, the saga of Shemitah produce goes on for quite some time, because for different products, for some products it starts at the very beginning of Shemitah, and for some products it will continue well past the end of Shemitah. So this is something that'll be, for at least a year and a half, something that people will be dealing with. So if you're a consumer, what are you worried about? What are your options in terms of buying food during Shemitah, produce in Israel or from Israel? What are your options? What are the different things that are on the market? And most of us are not farmers, and even if I have a fruit tree, that's not really my main occupation. I don't have to worry too much. The truth is, there is what to worry about, but we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But from the perspective of the consumer, so what are the options during Shemitah? And you hear different terms thrown around. Let's just define what we're talking about. So as follows: where do we get our food in Israel? If you can't really work the land and you can't really harvest in the normal way, so where does the food come from? There are 3 different options that are on the market here in Israel. Each has their advantages and their drawbacks. So one of the options that's on the market is called heter mechira. Heter mechira means that the farmers sell their land to non-Jews. It's done through the rabbanut, and in this way, the assumption is that alleviates the prohibitions of Shemitah, and then they can work the land, they can produce, and the produce can be eaten without getting involved in any of the halachas of Shemitah. This is a very, very common phenomenon, and much produce in Israel is produced in this way. There are both halachic and hashkafic hesitations with regard to heter mechira. Starting from the hashkafa, this has been a great debate over the past 150 years, 140 years, ever since Jewish agriculture was reinstated in Israel. Is this a good idea? We're essentially just circumventing the halach of Shemitah, which the Torah gives us. So is that the right way to treat a mitzvah? Just try to circumvent and avoid. That's from a hashkafic plane. From a halachic plane, there were poskim who claimed that this doesn't work. That you sell the land to a non-Jew, that does not alleviate the prohibitions of Shemitah, or that it is forbidden to sell the land to a non-Jew to begin with. So there were those who have significant hesitations with regard to heter mechira. There are great rabbanim who defend the need for heter mechira. How are we to have the survival of Jewish agriculture in the land of Israel if we don't allow them to be competitive? They're simply going to go under, and the land will be taken over by others. What's it going to mean for the state of Israel if the entire food supply is coming from the outside? We're very vulnerable. So there's a great need for heter mechira. This is a debate that goes back and is debated ad hayom hazeh. As a general rule, the Haredi establishment is fairly opposed, at least certainly in Ashkenazic circles, fairly opposed to heter mechira. In Sephardi circles, Rav Yosef was a strong defender of the heter mechira. In Dati Leumi circles, it's usually been very, very popular, the heter mechira, and in Mesorati circles, certainly heter mechira is the standard. Another option is what's called Yevul Nachri, produce of non-Jews. So it's not that the Jewish farmer sold his land to the non-Jew. It's actually really owned by non-Jews. And that is the, what's become popular in Haredi circles. You avoid the problems of the heter mechira. You don't have to deal with the prohibitions of Shemitah. The produce presumably doesn't have kedusha shvius. Everything is much easier, much simpler. What are the drawbacks? The drawbacks are twofold. Number one, the Torah's vision for Shemitah is not necessarily that we totally avoid. In fact, the Torah says of Shemitah produce, li'ochla, v'yisaha aretz hachem lochem li'ochla, it's for you to eat. So in fact, there were some who understood that it's a mitzvah to eat Peros Shvius. So you're simply not doing that. You're undermining that, number one. Number two, you're weakening. There are those who are opposed because they say you're weakening Jewish agriculture. How are you going to allow Jewish farmers to continue to exist if you only give your business to non-Jewish farmers? In general, we have a preference to give our business to our fellow Jews. We're going to dafka give our business to the non-Jews. Not only that, who are the non-Jews? A lot of the non-Jewish produce is coming from entities that are sometimes not on strong terms with the state, not our best friends. It's coming from adjacent territories, coming from Gaza, it's coming from Jordan, coming from Turkey, countries or entities that not necessarily are best friends. And as mentioned earlier, it could leave us vulnerable. Imagine if our entire food chain is dependent on the good graces of Hamas and Jordan and Turkey. So then that leaves us very vulnerable. So there are people who are not in favor of Yevul Nachri, but that is a popular solution. There is something else which is called Otzar Beis Din. Otzar Beis Din is currently being pushed by various organizations. There are some in the Haredi world who are very in favor of Otzar Beis Din. Some in the Dati Leumi, and especially the Chardali world, who are very much in favor of Otzar Beis Din. What's the concept of Otzar Beis Din? As follows. There's all this produce that's growing in the field, let's say. That was planted during the 6th year, but it's not really ready to be harvested yet. So for me to go ahead and harvest it all as per usual and then to sell it, so harvesting as per usual is us, and selling Shemitah produce is us. But each person can come and take. Now, practically speaking, if I live in Beit Shemesh and there's a field, an hour drive away, I'm not going to drive an hour to go pick a few tomatoes and bring them home. It's not worth my while. But there's no reason that I can't appoint somebody else. I can have somebody else do it for me, and I can't pay him for his services. So the Beis Din goes ahead and appoints certain people. It will happen to be the people who run that agricultural area, the farmers themselves and their staff, to pick the produce on behalf of everybody. And they will pay them for their services. And then when the goods are distributed to customers, they're not sold to customers. The customer is a member of this organization and thereby pays a fee which goes to pay the labor of those who are picking the produce. This is the basic idea of Otzar Beis Din. It can, from a distance, look like you're buying and selling the fruits and the produce, but that's not how it's formally structured. And there will be practical differences as well. There are many activities that the farmer will generally do to the produce to make sure that it is of high quality, which he cannot necessarily do during the Shemitah. Each activity will be, he'll have his guidelines from the Beis Din, what he is allowed to do, what he's not allowed to do, and he'll play by those rules. So Otzar Beis Din is a way to allow the produce to be eaten, like the Torah says, la'achla, that the produce of Shvius is meant to be consumed. It's a way to give some profits to the Jewish farmers without relying on the heter mechira, and the practical ramification of that is that you have to treat the produce with kedusha. If it's from that source, it has kedusha shvius. So then there are rules as to how that produce must be consumed. So I think the organization that is most well known that does Otsar Basin is what's called Otsar Haaretz. They're going to, for those who sign up with them, which I happen to be in favor of. I'm a fan of Otsar Haaretz, and the yeshiva will be using their produce as well. They plan to supply produce from a range of different sources, from produce that was grown in the 6th year and then preserved as long as they can, from Otsar Bezdin, which I just described, from other interesting sources they have in certain areas of Eretz Yisrael. So they have produce that's grown detached from the ground. A whole discussion: what's the status of produce if it's not really attached to the ground? Torah says that the rules of Shemitah apply to uses the term eretz. Let's say it's grown not attached to the ground. It's grown hydroponically. It's grown in what's called matzah menutak, which is essentially like the greenhouses detached from the actual ground. So there are many poskim who rely on that, at least in certain areas of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is also not all the same status, so they provide from there as well. So some of those produce will be kedusha shvius, and then it would need to be treated accordingly. What does it mean to treat kedusha shvius produce accordingly? How is it meant to be treated? So the main rule is, the Gemara says, based on the word li'ochla, that the produce is meant to be eaten. The Gemara says li'ochla v'lo lehefseid, that it's meant to be eaten as opposed to ruined. So to directly ruin produce that has the status of kedusha shvius is forbidden. So if a person has, let's say a person has vegetables of kedusha shvius, so he's not allowed to just throw it in the garbage. That would be called directly ruining. However, you're certainly allowed to use it. The Torah says la'ochla. It means it's supposed to be used. It's supposed to be eaten. It's supposed to be consumed, and it can and must be consumed in the normal fashion. What does it mean in the normal fashion? It has to be consumed in the way that people normally consume that particular product. So if there's a product that's generally eaten raw, so it's not eaten cooked, you're not supposed to cook it. If it's usually eaten as opposed to juiced, you're not supposed to juice it. If it's usually eaten juiced, so you are supposed to juice it. Each thing according to the way that it is normally used. Now, let's say at the end of the day, I don't consume everything. Sometimes there's leftovers. Sometimes there's things that get thrown out. So how you deal with that if it has kedusha shvius? So there are two different approaches, really both of which are acceptable. The more stringent approach is that you can't throw anything out until it rots. So what does that mean? Let's say I have something I'm not going to finish. We would try, Raphy, I'll get to your question momentarily. We would try to take only what we're actually going to eat. But let's say I have something which is not going to be fed. I'm going to throw it out. So there are those who will have a special receptacle for this type of produce. They'll put it into there and they'll leave it until it goes bad. They'll leave it for a couple of days, and then they'll throw it in the garbage. Now you have to make sure if you do that you don't put new stuff the next day onto the stuff that's already spoiling now, because then you're directly ruining the new produce that you're throwing out. So you'd have to put down a new layer. You'd have to have a new bag, a new receptacle, and there are many people who do that. Really, me'ikar adin, you don't have to do that at the yeshiva, when we will have produce that's kedusha shvius. We're not going to do that because that's on such a big scale. It's many people do that in their house, but on such a big scale, it's hard to manage. There's room to say that you could put it into a bag and then tie up the bag and tie it up well, or tie it up in another bag, and you could throw it out. You can dispose of it in that way, because it's not going to directly mix with other garbage. What you should not do is simply throw it into the regular garbage, or throw it into its own bag and then put other garbage on top of it, which makes it disgusting, makes it inedible as far as people are concerned. When that happens, so then that's called ruining directly the Shemitah produce. That's what we try to avoid, okay? But to put it into a bag, to put all of the different leftovers into the bag, and then to tie it up well, so when you throw it out, it doesn't mix with other garbage, and then it'll spoil on its own in the bag. So that would be acceptable. Raphy has a good question. Fruit smoothies, would that be usher? I think that's a fairly common way to use fruit today. Fruit smoothies are very popular. It doesn't have to be that it's the most common way, because then there'd only be one way that you could use any particular product. We have to take a poll. 51% of all apples are used in this way. That's the only way. It has to be that it is a common way to use a particular product. So fruit smoothies being very common, I think that is common enough to be considered normal usage. Normal usage is justified for Shvius produce. So I don't think it would be a problem to make the fruit smoothies. Okay. But we have to figure out for each thing what's common enough. It's not always obvious what would be considered common enough. But to use it in the normal way, that's what we're looking for. Okay, so these are some of the options that will be available for the consumer. As mentioned, you have the heter mechira, you have the full nachri, and then you have the otsar based in. What about household plants or people who have gardens, etc.? So what is permissible during the Shemitah year? The Gemara contrasts between two terms, le'ukmei and le'avruye. Le'ukmei means to just allow it to continue to exist, to prevent damage to the land, to the trees, to the plants, or whatever it is. So, or even to the produce. So that you can do. Le'ukmei you can do. Le'avruye means to repair, to improve. That you're not supposed to. You're not supposed to do any action which would improve whatever it is that's growing, that's growing during the Shemitah year. Okay, Daniel, it's a good question. We'll come to your point momentarily. I'll address it now. Why not? Okay, if you have hefker produce, let's say you have a tree and you have an apple tree, so you have to be mafker the apples and let people come and pick them. Does that mean that there are no limits? Daniel asks very well. I don't want people walking through my yard in the middle of the night. It would be disturbing to me. So that's totally fine. You're allowed to make those limits. They don't have free passage in your property. They just have the right to take the produce. So if your tree hangs over the fence and anyone can come on the sidewalk and pick, okay, so then there's no limits. They can come pick whenever they want. If in order to pick, they need to walk through your property, then you certainly have the right to define times when you allow them to walk through the property and times when you don't allow them to walk through the property, as long as you make it accessible. And sometimes it doesn't have to be that they have free passage through your entire property just because you happen to have hefker apples in your property. Okay, Ilan asks, what about in American supermarkets? They sell vegetables that are grown in Israel. Can Americans buy this? It's a very, very, very fair question. One would want to just check out what's the status of those vegetables. Are they grown during the 6th year? Are they grown during the 7th year in violation of Shemitah? Then for sure it's aser. Are they grown through heter mechira? Here's where a reliable hashgacha would come in. I think it definitely would be advisable to buy only products that have a reliable hashgacha, because otherwise it's impossible to know what the status of the produce is. I can't say with certainty, oh sure, buy this company or that company. I don't know where they're getting their stuff. So it would need to come with a reliable hashgacha. And then a reliable hashgacha will make sure that it's coming from a source which is acceptable. If you want to know what the standards of that hashgacha are, you can call it hashgacha and find out. If the hashgacha that it appears with is the rabbanut, which I doubt that would be the case in America, but if that's what it is, and it is from the 7th year and from Israel, then standard is that it probably is heter mechira. And, so different Rabbanim will have different guidelines with regard to heter mechira. Heter mechira is not my top choice. I wouldn't personally buy heter mechira on purpose, but if one does have it, I do not think that it is forbidden to eat heter mechira. I would not consider it to be not kosher. I think it can be considered to be kosher, but certainly there's plenty of room for Rabbanim of different communities to guide their constituencies as they see fit on this issue. Okay, some more details in terms of what a person can do in his own house, in his own property, in his own garden. So I mentioned the distinction between le'okmei and le'avruye. So that will have wide application for those who live in Israel with regard to even just care for their own garden, if they have grass, if they have a yard, if they have trees, if they have plants. What are they allowed to do? What are they not allowed to do? They're allowed to do anything which will prevent damage. They're not allowed to do anything which will stimulate growth. That's the distinction. Preventing damage is acceptable. Stimulating growth is not acceptable. So obviously planting is not acceptable. But even beyond that, it will, I think it would be very helpful if people have a gardener, that he's a gardener that is familiar with the halachas. Or at the very least, a person should be familiar with the halachas. So even, let's say, can you water your plants? Can you water your grass? Well, without being watered, they'll die. So you certainly can water them. On the other hand, at a certain point, it's not about preventing them from dying, preventing them from damage. It's about stimulating growth. They'll grow better if they have more water. So that would be a problem. Today, many people have automatic watering systems. So you can certainly set it before Shemitah to water as much as you like. And then it waters automatically during Shemitah. That would not be a problem. What about setting it during Shemitah or manually watering during Shemitah? So then that would only be permissible as needed to prevent damage, not to stimulate further growth. In most people's yards or gardens, that will be less water than normal in a regular year. What I've seen quoted for most types of grass in most parts of Israel, you'd have to check with your local gardener, is an hour and a half of water every week and a half. So that's much less than most people water in a normal year. But again, that's the general cloud. We're only doing what's necessary to prevent damage, not what would be optimal for stimulating growth. That'll be true for all other areas. So let's say cutting the grass. Can you cut grass during Shemitah? The answer is, if it's a matter of upkeep and you don't want your yard to look like a mess, that would be acceptable. We would like to do it in a way that is not stimulating further growth. So if the grass is very patchy, or it's new grass, which has never been cut, so apparently cutting it stimulates further growth. That's something to be careful about. Or if the grass gets too long, so then the roots don't get sun, and when you cut it, that stimulates further growth. So ironically, during Shemitah, we would prefer to have very regular cutting of grass as opposed to irregular cutting of grass, because that will better fulfill the tanai of le'okmei, of preventing decay and damage as opposed to stimulating growth. Same will be true of cutting, pruning, plants or bushes or trees. Anything that's being done to get rid of unhealthy, things and to prevent decay, or just to maintain what there already is. So you're cutting it all the time to maintain it exactly as it is. That would be okay. But the type of pruning which would stimulate growth, so that would not be okay. And that's something that will depend on the specific circumstances at that time. Same will be true with regard to fertilizing. Fertilizing is totally meant to stimulate growth. So that will be problematic during Shemitah. And Shemitah is fast approaching, but it's best to prepare for this in advance. Oftentimes fertilization can be done once a year, and that'll last. So that would be done before the Shemitah, and then it can be done again after the Shemitah. During the Shemitah, that would be an example of something which is meant to stimulate growth, and therefore that would be improper. What about plants that grow in a in a pot? A person might have them in their house plants, or on their mirpeset, on their porch. So this is an interesting discussion. What about potted plants outside? So there is a great discussion posted. We're not going to go whole shiur on this topic right now. But as a general rule, potted plants outside, more problematic. Inside the house, a potted plant, assuming as well that it has a bottom, which is not just made out of ceramic, but it has, let's say, a plastic or something on the bottom, and it's inside the house, so there is room for leniency, even planting during the Shemitah, because it's not considered to be attached to the land, to the ground. It's not considered to be outdoors, and therefore, presumably, the Yisurim Shemitah do not apply. That's only if it's inside, it's covered. If it's covered and surrounded by walls. So inside the house, a house plant, that would be totally fine. Once it's outside, let's say on a mirpeset, if it's not covered, so then that's not called in the house. Then you're only allowed to do what's necessary to maintain an existing plant, whereas planting a new plant or doing anything to stimulate growth, that would be forbidden, just like plants that are growing in the garden. Okay, so what we've discussed is the concept of le'okme versus le'avruye. When it comes to plants, as relevant for people who actually live in Israel and have plants. Here's a question: the machlokas of Kook and Chazon Ish, whether okme is designated to the fruit or the tree. Okay, a major machlokas, right? Does the okme mean only to maintain the tree, but activities done laokme on the peiros are a problem? Or laokme means even for the peiros? The Chazon Ish here is more lenient than Rav Kook, which is true in many areas of Hilchos Shmita. Interestingly enough, Rav Kook was a big supporter of the Heter Mechira, and the Chazon Ish was a big opponent of the Heter Mechira. But with regard to many of the details of what you're allowed to do, Chazon Ish was much more lenient than Rav Kook. I think that there's definitely room for leniency, particularly for people for whom this is their livelihood. In your own private garden, where it's just for fun and you don't really need it that much, you may as well be machmir. But for farms and the like, there's certainly a lot of room to be making, like the Chazon Ish, especially given that Shmita Bizman Hazeh, according to most poskim, is derabanan, and you have this big machlokas about dinim derabanan, and this will be more so true by malachos derabanan, without getting into the whole discussion of which malachos are derais derabanan. But then you're dealing with a machlokas about a double derabanan. Certainly room to be makel in that situation, like the Chazon Ish. Okay, so what we've raised is some of the concepts that maybe stand behind the Indian of Shemitah, some of the takeaways from this important mitzvah. We spoke about the concept of Peiros Shvius and Kedusha Shvius and the different options that are available to the consumer, Heter Mechira, Vol Nachri, and Otzar Bezdin. We spoke a little bit about how to treat produce that has Kedusha Shvius, and we spoke about some of the basics of what to do with your own personal garden, potted plants, and the like. I think these are some of the major topics of discussion with regard to Shemitah. So once again, to keep in mind that this is an opportunity for a year of Kedusha, an opportunity to interact with Kedusha in the form of Peiros, and to be Mekayim, one of the important mitzvahs, Hatzluyos Ba'aretz. The Torah itself says that in absence of keeping the rules of Shemitah, we open ourselves and become vulnerable to tremendous punishment, to galus. Galus is because of the fate of not keeping Shemitah properly. So the opportunity to do our best in keeping Shemitah certainly is an important tikkun for that, and an important major schos. Once again, if anyone has any further questions, feel free to discuss, to ask now, and feel free to follow up. Happy to be available for any consultations that anyone might want. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I Shalom.
Thank you, Rav.
Good to see you.
Thank you, Rav Siev.
Pleasure. Good to see you again.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Raphy.
Rav Siev.
Ilan, is it appropriate to ask guests for Shabbos what they hold before eating as a guest? In other words, you're a guest and you're going to their house? That's the question? I assume that's what you mean. Okay, so you certainly can do that. You certainly can do that. If you're comfortable eating one particular source and not from another, then it would make sense to do that. As I said, I wouldn't absolutely disqualify any of the options, whereas I personally don't buy heter mechira, but I wouldn't say that you're not allowed to eat heter mechira. Givul nachri, certainly, you're allowed to eat it. All the options are permissible to be in. So I don't know if I would find it absolutely necessary to get involved, but if a person is makbid, or a person just wants to know in advance what he's getting himself into, or if a person is makbid, I will not have X, so then yeah, you want to find out in advance what your hosts, what your hosts are doing. You want to have that conversation. Okay, Mordechai, great to see you, at least in name. So.
Thank you, Ravi. Rav. Thank you.
Okay, great to see you. Great to see you.